Whoever you are, wherever you are, and whenever it is, you are catching some brainwaves coming to you from the banks of the St. Vrain River in Longmont, Colorado, the setting of the first ever Rocky Mountain Leadership Forum on Dyslexia. I'm Ben Kolb, and across the table is the only co-host who perfectly knows the definition of a forum. It's Becky Peters. Becky, what's good?
It is all good, Ben. I'm super excited to be bringing giants in education to the earbuds of busy teachers and administrators. And for this episode, we have a special focus. Our district, St. Vrain Valley Schools, in collaboration with Learning Ally, which we'll talk more about, is hosting the first ever Rocky Mountain Leadership Forum on Dyslexia on March 9th, bringing people together from districts around the state to discuss what's working and what needs to change around supporting our students with dyslexia. So you challenged me, what's a forum?
What is a forum?
It is a place, meeting, or medium where ideas and views on a particular issue can be exchanged. So as a district, we've had people digging into this work for a couple years, and there are so many nuances and variables that we want to talk about it with other leaders and other districts in this forum style. There's how to screen for dyslexia, how to identify students who are struggling, how to support parents of students with dyslexia, what core and supplemental curriculum to use. The list is just never ending. And to compound the complexity of that, there's still so many solutions out there that aren't research-based or might work in certain settings but not others. We know that individuals learn differently and at different rates, and personalizing education for the striving student is something that all educators are passionate about. None of us like to see our students struggle, nor do we particularly enjoy the behaviors that inevitably emerge when students experience unproductive struggle. Understanding dyslexia and how to support families experiencing it is an extremely nuanced and multifaceted issue that we absolutely cannot do justice to in one short podcast episode.
That is so true, Becky, but there is something we can do, and it's what we're going to do in this episode, and that is provide some ground for our March 9th discussion, really have some common language. We're going to plant some seeds for questions that we want to be spinning on and percolating on during that day, and we want to get some points in our minds so we can hit the ground running when we are all together on March 9th. It is going to be an incredible day, and that's really the goal of this episode. And to help us do that, we brought in some experts like we always do, Doctors Eide. Brock and Fernette, their husband and wife doctors, they co-authored the book Dyslexic Advantage and the Mislabeled Child. Their nonprofit, found online at dyslexicadvantage.org, does a ton of work to unearth and celebrate the lives of people who live with and thrive with dyslexia. Their newsletters, online course, and podcast provide a wealth of information about dyslexia, so make sure you check that out if you haven't already.
Yeah, and a caveat on this before we start. The more Ben and I learn about dyslexia, the more we realize that we know very little about it. The physiological nature of the diagnosis, the individuality of expression, the different brain patterns, all of that was new to us. My first inclination is to celebrate that after more than 15 years in education, Ben and I are getting a chance to learn more about this language processing disorder that affects between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 students in our classrooms. But a second inclination that comes quickly after that is to question how well are we preparing our teachers to handle individual cases with these specific indicators?
Yeah, those were my feelings exactly. There was a lot of hashtag fake news that I believed about dyslexia before this, which kind of doesn't make me feel great. There are so many myths. Like, I used to think that it was visual, and now I know it's language-based. I used to think that dyslexia was when you saw your numbers and letters backwards, and I know that's not true. And I even thought that boys had it more than girls. There are so many things floating out there and misdefinitions of dyslexia that it's really important that we get. And thinking back to the time that I was in the classroom, I was doing the math, and I taught 2,000 kids in the classroom teaching, and so that's like 200 to 400 kids that I had in my class who had dyslexia that I didn't know really how to help them the most, and that kind of gives me a pit in my stomach. So we know that as teachers, we need to do better. We need to do better as districts and systems in helping teachers identify the signs and then arming them with tools to support the students in their classroom with dyslexia. The other caveat we wanted to mention is that the more we talked to parents and teachers, the more we learned about perceptions and nuances around the language. In this interview, we're going to talk to Doctors Eide about the brain patterns that emerge from people who lead successful lives. As the authors say, these peoples have led successful lives because of, not in spite of, their dyslexia. We think that's an important part of the discussion, but we've also learned that it's really important to talk about the struggle, to not be afraid to talk about what has been hard in learning for these students. Students and parents want to learn about the brain patterns that are causing them or their children's difficulty when learning how to read. It's a real thing that up to 20% of our children in public schools struggle with. It comes with tears and embarrassment and shame and loathing. It's not something we just gloss over by saying that it's always something that we just celebrate. So as you mentally prepare for our discussion on March 9th, when we're together in person, remember that people with dyslexia need our support, our listening ears need our well-developed, well-researched expertise so that we can make their education experience as amazing as possible.
That's really well said, Ben. And I was actually talking to a parent and a colleague just the other day in preparation for this episode, and she said a few things that I want to share with listeners from one mom's perspective. One thing that she mentioned is that her son, who has dyslexia, hates when his teachers say things like, "I would never know you have dyslexia," which at face value sounds like the teacher's trying to maybe compliment him on his work. But what that really does is deny his struggle, his hard work, and the learner that he is. Another thing she told me is that both she and her husband were really frustrated at times because when they met with educators supporting her son, they would spend most of those meetings talking about how great her son was, which is nice, right? We all want to hear good things about our kids. But when we need to spend more than just a few minutes helping parents and students understand why and talk about the struggle, why they're struggling, what to do about it, and what interventions we're putting in place and what's working from those and what's not. She even went so far as to say, we're not afraid to have this conversation. Why are you? And that's kind of the question she would pose to the educators. So now, this is just one woman's experience, but she collaborates really closely with parents in similar situations, and I got the sense that these instances are more widespread. For her, it's not about overcoming dyslexia, it's about integrating dyslexia into her son's life. I think that's an incredible question for us all to try to answer, how we can do that better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's hard work, but it's important work. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of people with dyslexia, put ourselves in the shoes of parents with students who have dyslexia, so that we can better understand how our words and interventions are impacting them all. And that's really a lot of what March 9th is all about. In addition to that, we're going to be talking about screeners, interventions, core and supplemental curriculum. And we're going to talk a lot that day about how can we support families in this whole endeavor. The really cool part Becky and I are both super excited about is we're also going to have a student panel so that we can see things through student eyes, and then we're going to repackage that in the Dr. Eide interview, and we're going to release that to the Brainwaves listeners as a whole. So we're so excited to learn more about this with you all on that day. And with that, we're going to get to this interview. Becky and I are going to jump in and add things along the way and pose some questions for you all to think about before we see you on March 9th.
Cool. And before we get started, I also want to give a quick shout out to Learning Ally, who you'll become very familiar with before the forum's over, but check out some of their work before you come. You can find them at learningally.org and see how they're working with schools to support striving learners. Thank you to Learning Ally for being our partners in this and for all of the work you do for students. Now, on to the interview.
All right, well, we will get started here, and I'm sure you've answered this question a million times, but to help frame our conversation, we'd like to start with a simple question here, which is, what is dyslexia?
So it's important, I think, in areas where people are trying to screen for dyslexia to recognize the difference between dyslexia and just reading problems in general, because there are some important differences that have important ramifications later on. So dyslexia is really reading problems at the high level of reading. So in terms of being able to read with fluency and speed and accuracy that are caused by problems with lower level processing. So problems in being able to translate speech into code for spelling and decoding the coded written language back into spoken language. So reading problems in general can come from a broader range of things. They can come from problems with language formation and development. They can come from problems with attention. They can come from problems with sort of higher level language. But dyslexic problems are really a subset of reading issues, and they're really the issues that affect that coding challenge.
And the other thing I would add is that dyslexia, because science tells us that it's associated with brain-based differences, is that it's brain-based difference associated with differences in learning and also with strengths. So that's also a key point that we try to get across in our book and also in our nonprofit work as well.
So let's break that part down a little bit. And all of the things we talk about in here will be cited in our show notes. So please feel free to take notes on anything that you've seen refuted by more current research or anything that you want to learn more about. In any case, dyslexic processing can be indicated in a lot of cases through language problems: late talking, leaving out or reversing parts of words, retrieving words from memory, remembering grammar rules, rhyming, all of those things. So let's talk about those basic low-level processes that Dr. Brock just mentioned. One of the things they talk about in their book is phonological processing, and they cite that around 80 to 90% of individuals with dyslexia have problems with phonological processing, which results in difficulties decoding and encoding, where decoding is essentially sounding out words and encoding is more like spelling or constructing words. Two important processes within that are sound segmentation, which is the ability to split words into their component sounds, like k, at, to make cat, and sound discrimination, which is the ability to distinguish one sound from another. This becomes important when you think about what's called the phonological loop, which I'm going to quote from their book here: keeps auditory verbal information alive in active working memory until it can be processed, organized, and put to use. So when you think about that, the working memory, or as they call it, the mental desk space of our students with dyslexic processing, is completely overloaded, which then contributes to difficulties also with attention and planning.
All right, so the phonological processing issues contribute to a lot of the language issues when students are learning how to write or how to read. But another thing that I have learned that there's also a big difference in the brain of dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains when it comes to procedural learning. So at least half of individuals with dyslexia have significant problems with learning how to do something in a step-by-step manner and then learning the steps within that task to a point of automaticity. So if you think about the things we ask students to do the most, probably in school, they're procedural in nature, not just language skills, but math as well, like long division or borrowing, all of that stuff, forming letters, even just watching someone model something on a board and then asking them to repeat that task. When students without dyslexia watch a teacher draw a capital B on the board, most of them watch that and then implicitly can do it themselves just by observing and imitating. But when a student with procedural learning issues needs to learn this, they can't just watch and follow along and model. They need to be taught explicitly through direct instruction, where it's broken down and demonstrated clearly step by step. You can see how this could easily snowball to the point of frustration for any student who is expected to follow the same procedure day in and day out.
We then asked the Drs. Eide to talk about the scope of the diagnosis, and here's what they told us.
So it's important to recognize that dyslexia is not caused by a single gene difference. So if you have disorders that are caused by single genes or conditions caused by single genes, you can recognize sort of clear breaking points and markers between those who have it and those who don't. Dyslexia, risk for dyslexia is contributed to by multiple different factors. And so what you see is a normal distribution of the population. So you see some people with more traits, some people with fewer traits, and there's kind of a smooth curve. So the kind of official estimates at how many people would qualify for a diagnosis of dyslexia that would experience relevant problems in school that are caused by dyslexic issues ranges from 10 to 20%. So the official number that Congress used, for example, for the First Step Act that was recently passed, with their definition of dyslexia, they said 20% of the population are dyslexic. And I think a lot of people in schools will use a number between 10 and 20%. Of those, the number that know that they're dyslexic, it's going to vary at different grades. So in the early grades, probably, if you compare the number of people that are receiving special services with those population incidence figures that we get from doing population-based studies, about a quarter to a third. So it's really there's a large number of people out there that are experiencing important challenges at school that could be made better by intervention that are unaware of their dyslexia-related challenges.
So we know that it's a constellation. There are multiple factors, multiple expressions of patterns, and only about a quarter to a third of students know that they have it in early grades, which leaves a lot of students behind who would really benefit from interventions at an early stage in their life. So it's on us as districts and systems to screen for these issues and provide supports at early ages so that they have a better chance at having like a brilliant K-12 experience. How do we do that? Well, on March 9th, we'll talk about some of the ways that we've been doing that here in St. Vrain, but we certainly welcome and encourage others to share as well so that we can all be more informed about the resources and tools at our disposal. Some guiding questions for this segment could be, how do your teachers currently collaborate to serve students who show early signs of phonological or procedural processing issues? Also, what training are you providing for teachers in explicit research-based reading instruction and interventions? Now let's get back to the interview.
I think your work and it really has helped me understand the scope of this. And you frame it in your book as an advantage. So if you could take our listeners to the beach of Kauai and tell us about kind of the albatross you saw and what that can teach us about deficit-centric definitions.
So we use that metaphor in the book of the albatross as an example of an animal that functions really well in one environment and sort of poorly in another environment. And Fernette and I, when we were married, honeymooned in Kauai, and we saw the albatrosses flying off the Kilauea Point Lighthouse and just soaring beautifully. And then, thought about how these same animals, when they land on the beach, walk around like little drunken sailors and really have a hard time.
Their wings are too long, and it just seems like such a poor fit for being on land.
And they're undertrained for being on land after flying for months and months, and they just can't do it. And we thought that really reminded us so much of so many of the students that we worked with that seemed like they struggled and struggled and struggled with all the basic skill learning that they were doing in the early grades in school, and yet they had these other wonderful talents that just were not brought out by the school curriculum. And as we watched these students over the years, and as we all grew older together and watched them blossom into just amazing young people, and in some cases now, 20 years down the road, people that are doing amazing things as young professionals, it just became so apparent to us that we were really just seeing a partial picture when we looked through the lens of disability at these students, and we saw dyslexia only as something that produced difficulties. And I think one of the things that interested us most is that we not only saw consistent patterns within the challenges that they faced, but we saw consistent patterns and these kind of repeated things in their families and in the individuals themselves as they grew older to the talents that they expressed.
And I would add to that too. When we tested them, we could also see a lot of strengths too that often professionals might not point to, but were there. You look at these subtest scores, and sometimes it'd be off the charts in certain areas. And yet, if you average all the scores together, it sort of looks a little average, or a little, in some areas a little above, a little bit below. But they're not actually pointing out to these kind of superstar qualities that would be helpful for the students themselves to know, as well as their parents.
I think that analogy hit home to me really hard. I wonder how often our students with dyslexia feel like that albatross on the beach. Is it all day? Is it every day? It must be exhausting. Do they know that they have the skills to fly? Like, what's that really like? So that was really interesting for me to wrap my mind around and reflect on that. And I'm curious, how have you or people in your district tried to put yourselves in the shoes of a student with dyslexia or the families of students with dyslexia? How might you do that in the future? Better understanding their experience will go a long way to helping us serve their needs. Back to the interview. Becky asked the doctors directly about issues of calling it an advantage, like we'd alluded to earlier.
We had a question actually from a couple of people. We've been doing a little bit of work in our district with dyslexia, and we've been, trying to talk to parents and students, and we've heard echoes of conversations around and we're wondering if you ever get in discussions about this, like how do we celebrate the strengths of brain patterns in people with dyslexia without undermining the struggles that they go through every day? Like how do we balance that for the students and the parents that know that, hey, this is, we're going to have a hard time with reading and phonological processing and all these things. How do we both celebrate the strengths while also, I guess, honoring the difficulties?
I think it's really challenging, and one of the things that makes it especially challenging is that the strengths tend to emerge over time, and often they can be hard to see sometimes in younger students. They're also harder to see in the context of what's going on in the classroom. A lot of times earlier on during the educational process, in the early elementary grades, especially, the focus of everything is on acquiring basic skills, and that means mastering a set of procedures. So spelling, decoding math facts, written expression, forming your letters, learning how to punctuate, learning grammar and things like that. All of those things tend to be difficult for individuals with dyslexia. So the whole day at school often tends to be a really difficult time. So within the school structure itself, it's particularly difficult to celebrate strengths in that context. But oftentimes the strengths are showing up in outside activities. So, building things or coming up with imaginative worlds or telling stories or being strong in dance or strong in athletics or leadership qualities or other kinds of things. And learning how to recognize those strengths and just to recognize and validate the kids who show them as part of the daily process is important, because in the course of the normal school day, they really may not have too many chances to shine, especially in those early years.
The other thing I'd like to add too is Dyslexic Advantage recognizes a lot of what Brock talked about. And so as a result, we do have a number of programs for as young as 6 and then all the way through high school and actually then college too, where we're trying to allow students to discover their strengths. Like one, we have a kids writing program, which allows them to dictate or to type their work. We don't look at spelling or things like that, but we look at qualities like imagination, great storytelling voice, and wonderful perceptive insights for the creative writing program. Using assistive technology to allow these strengths to come through before their writing by hand is online is one way to kind of capture some of these gifts. The other student program that we have is an Ingenuity Award, which is like a STEM award, looking at kids' great ideas, how they follow through on them. Sometimes it's things like robotics. Other times it's things like developing an interesting way to solve a problem that they discovered at home. I mean, we've got some incredible projects that were done through our Ingenuity Awards. And as Brock said, a lot of these talents are possible after school. It's good not to burden students so completely with homework that they can't possibly finish. Give them downtime, give them time to actually recover, and also do activities that will ultimately help them develop these wonderful careers later on. And that might be in leadership positions, service, sports, and all sorts of other things.
I love how you outline those in the book too, with the different fields that have more, a higher ratio than you'd expect of people with dyslexia and things like that. And we're going to get into all of the strengths. I really love how you outlined them. But I'm curious too. You talk in the book about. You have an analogy that it's almost like trying to understand all about a caterpillar, but not really acknowledging that they turn into butterflies. And a lot of the examples that you give even are, strengths that kind of manifest later on in life. Is that part because it's just developmental and like some of these things take longer to develop in students, or are we just not fostering them in the right way or focusing on the right things to allow those strengths to come up earlier in their lives?
A lot of it is really a developmental issue because, as I mentioned, one of the kind of overarching themes in terms of learning and development for individuals with dyslexia is that they tend to have difficulty automating processes. So learning things through practice that they can do without thinking about them. And they also tend, as a group, to have lower working memory capacity. Now, these two things work together in a really unpleasant kind of way, because when you have difficulty automating things, the response that you need to do to be able to perform those tasks is to bump everything into working memory and do kind of talk yourself through it step by step consciously. Well, when you have issues with both automatic learning and working memory, you tend to have to move everything into working memory, but you've got a smaller capacity. So it's basically like trying to perform a really complicated task that you need to use a lot of tools for, but you've only got a really small workbench. Or, another analogy would be you have a really complex computer program that involves multiple steps and running multiple different processes at the same time, but you've got a really small processing capacity on your computer. So early on, you tend to bog down. You tend not to be able to complete those processes, and you tend to get really stuck and limited in the complexity of what you can do. As you get older, though, year by year by year, you get upgrades in your working memory capacity. And that at some point begins to kick in to the point where you can do more and more things consciously. Also, as you get more and more experience, that practice effect eventually does start to kick in and you begin to catch up. So oftentimes, what we see is that dyslexic kids are just the classic late bloomers where, they haven't really shown the signs of what's going to be their sort of a claim to success when they get older, all the way through elementary, middle school, even high school, even college in some cases. And then they just finally blossom and it all kind of comes together. So one of the key things that we've always found is that it's really important to support kids during those early years where they're not finding the success and they're not feeling their own strengths yet, and give them the vision of hope and just let them understand that their developmental kind of pattern is fated to be a late blooming one, that they have to keep believing, they have to keep trying, and eventually they're going to see the fruits of their success, but not to give up before that happens.
So the idea of hope and of like a late bloom, if you're like me, that feels very uncomfortable to educators and to parents too. We love seeing immediate impact. We love the aha moments. It's like one of the things that most of our colleagues say that they love most about teaching. So for me, this really brings about a reflection around my ability not only to seed hope in a striving student, but also how can I personally maintain that level of hope and high expectation when I see a student spinning their wheels? And how can I improve my own ability to provide the right intervention at the right time? Again, the same colleague that I was talking to earlier, or that I cited earlier, she likes to think of it as a gradual bloom instead of a late bloom, and said, I'm going to quote her here, "This is the beauty of knowing you're dyslexic. You can take the long view and know that this purposeful, strategic work, or the right fertilizer, is adding up over time. Without knowing, it's easy to attribute the slow progress to generalized stupidity. We say all of the time to our son, you just bumped into your dyslexia, take a deep breath, it will come, it is coming. When we learned our son was dyslexic, we felt like we could craft a response and contain the damage." So Dr. Brock addresses some of those same concerns for us later on in the interview. Let's listen to that here.
Yeah, in terms of focus, I think, a very important basic focus is really just to understand that, spend a little time understanding how dyslexic challenges in reading result from some of these low-level processing challenges rather than from deficits in high-level thinking, because it changes the way you think about intelligence. It changes the way you think about struggles in school with learning different kinds of things, and to really have a clear idea of those differences, I think gives teachers. It certainly gave us as professionals working with students a different way of relating to students that are really struggling in the classroom.
The other thing I would say is that we have a partner, Social Purpose Corporation, that actually is an iPad-based dyslexia screening app that these days there's no reason not to get identified. If you get identified, you'll start seeing your student really in a whole new way. There's also a mind strengths component that comes with the app. So, I think identification is important, and the strengths, as Brock mentions, is really key to a lot of this. A third thing I would say is that we're finding that structured literacy, having a specific program that's known and documented to work for students with decoding difficulties, is really important to get to these students early on. So another reason why, a lot of the state legislation that's making it important to screen students in the early grades is also really important in order to help students more quickly in their school journey.
Yeah, I want to add just one thing to what Fernette said there at the end, because I think we're constantly seeing these literacy battles, and they're always changing names over time. But currently, the battle is between structured literacy and balanced literacy, and the differences between those two is that structured literacy is really kind of a bottom-up approach where they focus on building the ability to deal with the coding and decoding process by understanding what's going on at the most basic levels and then building piece by piece from there. That kind of format is really ideally suited to kids who have dyslexic challenges and dyslexia-related challenges. And so for about a third of kids in the classroom, that's far and away the superior way to learn. Balanced literacy exposes kids to a lot of text, so a lot of simple stories and simple words and things like that. And then it kind of expects them to infer the underlying rules from that and gives them some support. But there's a lot of work that the child is expected to do automatically. And really what the balanced literacy system does is it takes advantage of the automatic learning systems that about 2/3 of individuals have that work, very well to kind of pull learning from larger blocks of information and recognize and internalize the rules that underlie some of those processes. That doesn't work very well for dyslexic students. As a matter of fact, for those with more severe dyslexic difficulties, it doesn't work at all. And so we see a lot of students that have been exposed to that kind of balanced literacy approach that will be struggling all the way through school, and they'll get to 15, 16, 17 years old and still be having problems, be ready to head off to college, and just not in any situation at all ready to tackle the demands of higher education because their challenges haven't been recognized. They've been bright enough to be able to get by and to achieve at an average level, but they're capable of achieving at a much higher level. It's very important that students that are built in a way that they need more explicit instruction in those very basic rules at the earliest steps of learning how to read and spell, get it at an appropriate time in their education. And that's why the early screening is so important. And, the screener Fernette mentioned, the URL for that for people that might be interested is neurolearning.com. And it's accessible directly to people, individuals, as well as we license to schools and other
universities as well,
other places.
Yeah.
But screening is really important, and other people are creating and providing screeners now too. And so I think that's going to be an important thing that happens over the next number of years, is that we'll be identifying students at earlier grades. But when we do identify, then it's important to get them into a structured literacy program.
So structured literacy, so important. We can't overstate that. And here are some reflection questions for us all when we think about that. What curriculum are we giving teachers access to? Does it support all of our learners? Do our teachers know how to tailor instruction for these different and varied patterns of development? Are we prohibiting a portion of our students from exercising their higher level thinking by stacking their day with more and more low-level interventions? We really need to examine our interventions and our core curricula and have conversations with teachers about it in order to best serve the students at an earlier and earlier age.
So now we're going to spend a little bit of time hearing about the potential strengths in brain processing for people with dyslexia. As you listen to this one example that Dr. Brock is going to share with us about a man named Jack Horner, try to parse out the evidence of the 4 mind strengths that the doctors cite in their research. And we'll preview those a little bit now. The first one, the M in MIND, is material reasoning, which are abilities that help us to reason about the physical or material world. Think about like spatial reasoning, engineering, construction, things like that. The second one, the I in mind, stands for interconnected reasoning, which describes abilities to see connections between different objects, concepts, or points of view. Patterns in this strength help people detect relationships between different objects or ideas, helps them to shift perspectives or approaches, and to reason using a global perspective. So think of like CEOs, entrepreneurs, scientists, economists, or even sociologists.
The N in mind is for narrative reasoning, which the doctors describe as the ability to construct a connected series of mental scenes from fragments of past personal experiences. Think about directors, storytellers, authors, creative writers. And then lastly, the D stands for dynamic reasoning, which seems to afford people the ability to see patterns over time. Entrepreneurs, scientists, futurists. Now, having previewed the MIND, let's hear about Jack Horner's story.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the most amazing stories of anybody that we've known and worked with is Jack Horner, who's a paleontologist who's now a professor of paleontology at Chapman University in Orange County, California. And Jack was born in Montana about 70 years ago now, in a very small town. And Jack was a child who struggled from day one in school. He just was not able to do anything well in the school environment. He had troubles with reading, with spelling, with doing his basic math, with doing anything that involved writing. And he was constantly being held back and experiencing failure in school, and he had all kinds of trouble with that at home. But outside of school, Jack lived in a very remote area in Montana, and he loved the outdoors. He loved nature. He spent a lot of time outside, and he was extremely good at looking into the rock formations in the hills around his home and noticing things that were there. And as a result of this ability, he was able, by the time he was 12 years old, to build an astonishing collection of fossils that he'd found in the area out behind his house. And actually, his local library put up a collection of his fossils that's still there in his hometown. And this really sparked his interest in science, and it began to branch out in other areas. And as he got a little bit older, he actually, at the same time that he was, consistently still getting D's and F's in school, he won the state science fair in Montana 3 years in a row. Aww. And at that time, there was no entrance requirement to get into college in Montana. So Jack was able to go on to college at the University of Montana, but he failed out seven different times. And they kept letting him come back in and try again and try
Change
again.
his major.
And he kept trying, and he just couldn't make any progress because he was unable to pass the tests and do things like that. But he learned a lot by going to classes, and he actually eventually left school and then went back to New Jersey and became a curator's assistant at Princeton University's museum, where he worked on their paleontological specimens. And he began to reorganize their collection, and he began to work with the paleontologists there, and they began to recognize that he had these talents, and they gave him more and more kind of responsibility. And then during his breaks every year, he would go back to Montana and take vacations and go fossil hunting with some friends. And during a couple of those trips back to Montana, he made some absolutely astonishing finds. And one of the things he did is he discovered nesting sites for the dinosaur Maiasaura, the good mother lizard, that were the first known nesting sites for dinosaurs that anybody had ever found. And he began to study the layout of these sites and began to make scientific predictions about dinosaur behavior on the basis of the nesting behaviors and things that he found.
Like the mothers found with the babies and things like that they were taking care of their babies.
He also found lots and lots of old dinosaur eggs there, and he tells a wonderful story about the fact that these eggs are tens of millions of years old, and everybody had always looked at dinosaur eggs as being these incredibly precious resources that they couldn't take a risk with, so they had to preserve them and be careful with them. And he said, well, that seemed ridiculous to me. I wanted to know what was inside of these things. And so he basically just took a hammer and started whacking at them and opening them up. And he found the first dinosaur embryos that anybody had ever described.
Oh my gosh.
And as a result of these findings, over a number of years, this guy who was never able to make it through college, who had no graduate degree of any kind, was given a MacArthur Genius Award for his work on dinosaurs, because he published some of the most revolutionary findings in dinosaur behavior biology in the 20th century. And as a result of that, Jack was eventually given a faculty position at Montana State University, and he became the head of the Museum of the Rockies out there, and was at Montana State for many years. And eventually, somebody finally awarded him an honorary PhD so that he could hire lab assistants and get grants. And Jack's become one of the leading paleontologists in the world. He's the kind of model for Dr. Grant in the Jurassic Park movies, and he served as the scientific advisor for all of those films. And he's written a number of wonderful books, and he's been a really leading light in science education as well.
So if you go to dyslexicadvantage.org, it's amazing, because there are like hundreds of stories just like that, YouTube videos just like that, and you can find evidence of all the different patterns of thought. Another one that the doctors highlighted was about narrative reasoning, and we'll keep the audio playing after that to hear the doctors respond to how we can better foster those strengths in our students.
Yeah, so narrative reasoning, as we define it, as you mentioned, is episodic reasoning, and in the long-term memory, so human long-term memory, we have two major categories. We have episodic memory, so that's basically your memory for things that you've experienced. And then semantic memory, which is basically non-contextual, kind of factual kernel-based memory. So it's memory of facts that are stripped from any context of experience. It's just, things that as information. And so an example, the poet you mentioned is Philip Schultz, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and just an amazing poet, and his ability to internalize the voices of the people that he's spoken with, and to assimilate their stories and form deep memories of those, where he remembers not only the things that he's told by different people, but the way in which they tell them, the facial expressions, the voices, how that fit in with things that he learned about their background, et cetera. And so you really have these very embedded voices that express character, they express experience, they express background. And he can use all of these different resources that he carries around in his mind that he's picked up through his interactions with people. So he's incredibly good at remembering all those kinds of things. Yet, he wrote an article a few years back about trying to navigate his way through airports, and it appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It was one of their most shared articles that year. And he has a horrible time remembering from one time to the next when he goes to the airport what he needs to do kind of at what stage to get through the whole process of doing things. And a lot of folks with dyslexia will describe similar types of things, and yet at the same time, he'll probably be forming permanent memories, of the person that he talks to at the different counters that are trying to tell him different things. So this pattern of tremendous strengths existing alongside real weaknesses is characteristic. And one thing we never want to do is underplay the challenges that people actually experience and the difficulties that people with dyslexia actually face in certain situations, because they really are epic struggles, and the ability to overcome them really requires a lot of heroism and a lot of strength. And we don't want to downplay that for a moment, but what we do want to emphasize is that these are not holes that are taken out of an otherwise complete person, but these are challenges that sit side by side, oftentimes with a great strength, and that the weaknesses exist because of a formation in ability that was programmed to create the strength. So focusing on the strength is usually the key to success, and learning to work around the weakness. I think when we've talked to students, and Fernette can comment on this too a lot, when we talk to students and adults, oftentimes the things that have made them especially resilient during school and that have helped them to find things to hold on to keep their faith alive have been things that a lot of people would think of in retrospect as being almost trivial. They were oftentimes just a comment that a teacher made, seemingly offhand, and at other times, more consistent comments over time. A teacher who took a particular interest in a student. But one of the people we talked about in the book was a guy named Dwayne Smith, who was a very successful coach of debate teams, and he worked actually in a community college and junior college which drew from a very underprivileged environment, and actually developed debate teams that were very successful on the national level from that environment. And when he was a student in high school, he was constantly in trouble behaviorally because he was acting up because he was doing so poorly in classes, and he was looking for attention, et cetera, et cetera. He described some of his practical jokes that he played, some of which were edited for the sake of our younger readers. But he had a very difficult time in school. And at one point after he graduated from high school, he found his way into a community college class, had no idea what he wanted to do, ended up in a speech class and gave a talk. And the teacher said to him, Dwayne, there were some real problems with the way that the speech was structured, and with, some of the language. We need to polish that up and work at that. But you have presence. And he said that was the first positive comment he had ever received from anybody in an educational setting. And he said that totally turned me around. He said, I was going to do anything I possibly could to get more compliments from that person. And I was going to hold on to that. I have presence. And he said, every time I got up to give a talk after that, I could feel the positive support in my own mind from that statement. And that really led to his whole professional career. It was just a small comment, picking one bright spot out of an otherwise undistinguished performance, but recognizing that spark of talent that he had, and that turned him around. Another person that we had was that we could talk about was Jack Laws, who was a wonderful artist and naturalist and teacher.
And he had two high school teachers, who actually turned his life around. They said, you've got really good ideas. You can't always spell them and write them out. But you've got really good ideas. And that just gave him the possibility, gave him the confidence. And he said he was willing to do anything for these teachers. And he's still in touch with them today, 20, 30 years later. So giving positive feedback is so important.
So on Brainwaves, we've heard over and over from our guests about the power of a moment and the power of connection with a teacher. So a guiding question for us on March 9th might be, how are we balancing positive feedback with direct challenge? And are we doing enough of that authentically for our struggling students? And I also want to invite us to think, if we can't find positive feedback to give, what does that tell us about the learning activities that we're designing for those students? Lastly, this is the last audio clip we're going to play. We asked the doctors for the biggest myth they find themselves having to bust over and over.
I think one of the big myths is that there's not simple, understandable differences between dyslexia and just poor reading in general. And I think it's really very, very important for people to understand that there are difficulties with reading that result from broader difficulties with thinking and with processing language, and things that will cause more difficulties with more activities, and then that comparing that with dyslexia, where the difficulty is really pretty focal. It really is on just kind of dealing with these transitions into and out of code, and with doing these kind of automatic low-level processes, but where higher-level thinking is preserved, and in many cases where it can really be pretty impressive. And it's so easy to underestimate the intelligence of a child who's really struggling with so many things in the classroom. I mean, one of our board members now that we just heard from recently, a recent board member who's a professor and the head of the plasma physics lab at Princeton University, talked to us about his early years in school, where he just didn't do anything well. He didn't read basically at all until he got to fifth grade, and he struggled in so many different areas in the school, and he never, ever went to school and felt smart with anything. And yet, he's in the top tiny fraction of scientific creativity and intelligence in the whole world. And it's really important not to let performance on these basic skill categories overly influence your impression on somebody's potential for the future, on their potential intelligence and creativity, because the kinds of thinking and learning that support basic skill acquisition are totally different from the kinds that support high-level creative activity.
So really, it is an age-old problem here. We know that deficit thinking is bad, and we can't just focus on the negatives, but we know that when we just focus on the strengths and the good parts, that there are real challenges that we can gloss over. And so we hope that we really did a good job of honoring both of those. We have to understand that it is a struggle for our students with dyslexia, but that doesn't mean they're damaged. It doesn't mean they're incapable. It means we just need to find another way to explicitly teach a concept.
We hope you found this episode to be a helpful starting point to our conversation, and we're really looking forward to following it up with that student panel. We can't wait to meet you all in person. In the meantime, check out our show notes, like I said earlier, for links mentioned in the episode. Check out dyslexicadvantage.org for more information, and consider the guiding questions for discussion when we're all together. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, have a great generic time of day.